All right, I think we'll get started now. I should say there'll be time at the end for questions. I find that probably you find praxeology a bit on the hard side, at least if you're like the students who've been coming through here in the 25 years that I've been here. So we'll allow some time at the end for questions. I should say, I must confess, this talk has given me problems. What happened was, as I mentioned in my previous lecture, I don't usually give that lecture, the introductory lecture on praxeology. I gave that only because Hans Hoppe wasn't here. And what I did was I put in a lot of the material I usually use for this lecture on epistemological problems of economics in that lecture. So it leaves me the problem, possibly an epistemological one, of what am I going to do in this lecture? And I thought I'll develop some of the points I did in the previous lecture and maybe raise some new ones. I should say it reminded me, a predicament I'm in, reminded me of a story about my greatest teacher at UCLA, Walter Starkey, who was, he had been, when I had him, he was quite old. He was even older than I am now. And he had been earlier a professor at Trinity College, Dublin. Samuel Beckett was one of his students. And he was a very distinguished person. So once he was giving a lecture, and a student put up his hand and he said, you're giving the same lecture that you gave the last time. And Dr. Starkey said, well, it's not exactly the same, is it? And the student made the mistake of saying, yes, it's exactly the same. Dr. Starkey said, that's the trouble with you Americans. You never want to hear the same thing twice. Now, I wanted to start off with developing a point I raised the last time. You'll remember one of the principles we learned from praxeology. Remember, in praxeology, we're trying to see what follows from the concept of action, what we can learn about economics just by thinking about action or particular acts. And if we consider exchange as one particular type of act, we'll see that in an exchange, each person values what he's getting more than what he's giving up. If I'm exchanging an apple for an orange, I have an apple, I want an orange, so I value the orange more than the apple, and the person who wants the apple will value the apple more than the orange he's giving up. And you'll recall I suggested this principle really is a way of striking at a fundamental point of Marxism, because according to the Marxist account of value, every exchange requires an equality. And Marx goes on to say that the equality can only lie in the amount of labor time in each commodity, in each good that's going to be exchanged. Now, I want to develop that point. It's what I said so far and what I said previously is not incorrect, but it's a bit oversimplified. And I wanted to ask, how do you think, would anybody have any ideas, how would a Marxist, that's say someone who says that in order to explain how the price that goods exchange against each other, the exchange ratio, say, by exchange an apple for so many oranges, how do we determine this exchange ratio? According to the Marxists, this requires some equality. How do you think a Marxist might respond to this point if you say, well, it wouldn't make sense to have an exchange unless there's a double inequality, unless each person values what he's getting more than what he's giving up. How do you think a Marxist might respond to that, other than throwing up his hands in despair? Do we have any? Yeah.
It's a mutual exploitation.
Yes, that's like the one, capitalism is the exploitation of man by man, and socialism is the reverse of that. But well, I mean, even if someone were, but I mean, how could Marxists say there's an equality if it seems there's a double inequality? I mean, supposing he said, well, each side is exploiting the other one, as you suggest, that wouldn't respond to the difficulty. Anyone else have any suggestions? Yeah.
Would it be that the individuals in the exchange aren't themselves acting, but rather are acting based on their classes, like their class preferences, and they make their decisions based on that, not individual values? That wouldn't affect this point, though. I mean, that would be something on how the individuals would come up with whatever preferences they had, but that wouldn't really tell us why we need an equality if the Marxists thought that we did. Yeah.
False consciousness, so that one of the individuals is deluded?
Well, I mean, I don't think, but supposing, would the Marxists want to say that, though? But even if, you see, he wouldn't have to claim, would he want to claim that you're deluded if you want an orange more than an apple or an apple more than an orange? I don't think that would be very plausible. I mean, they believe in false consciousness, but I don't think about basic preferences. They want to say that. All right, well, I'll take, we have a couple more good, but
try to find an objective feature about the two commodities.
And why do you need to do that?
Because you have to find out what makes them equal.
Pardon me?
You have to find out what makes them equal.
Yes, but I mean, why do you need to do that if the exchange has a double inequality? You say, in an exchange you have this double inequality. Why do you need to find an equality?
Because Marx says that trade itself is a result of equality.
Well, yes, you're right. He certainly makes that claim, but why? What's the basis for it? I'll take one more.
Because Marx says there was a new economic man, that they would pursue the good of their culture. So in that, they would seek an equal exchange for trading.
Well, I don't really think it would depend on a particular. He wouldn't think that would have to do with a particular culture. I don't think. I mean, he would think that any exchange where there's an exchange value requires an equality. Well, what I think the answer is that Marx could admit, he could say, yes, you do have in an exchange, you have this double inequality. You value what you're getting more than what you're giving up. But he could say, this has nothing to do with determining what the exchange ratio is. This will just explain why people want to make an exchange at all, but that the price was determined in this other way. So to really get how the Austrian view refutes Marxism, you have to say not only that you have the double inequality, but that you can explain prices in terms of the subjective valuations of each person, that you don't need to bring in all this apparatus of an equality of exchange and then say why, try to find out what that is to explain exchange. So it's a point that very often missed. People will say, well, just because just by pointing to the double inequality, they say this knocks out Marxism and similar views. You need more than that. You need to say it's the double inequality plus that the subjective preferences are
sufficient to explain the exchange ratio. I hope you get that point. That might be on the final exam, not to give any hints, at least when I'm asking the questions. All right, now I want to go over some points having to do with the nature of preference. I noticed in the other session that's going on at the same time is this. Jeff Herberner is going to be talking about this topic also. So apparently people don't have a choice of whether they want to hear about preference or not. That you're going to get even if you go in the other room. So I want to start with talking about what's meant when we say people are trying to maximize their utility, or in choosing you're trying to increase your utility. This is a notion that's often misunderstood. You're probably familiar, or I'll ask, how many of you are familiar with a type of ethical philosophy called Utilitarianism? Oh, good. Now, this is a view that was developed by, I think, the French 18th century Enlightenment philosopher Helvetius developed this, and Jeremy Bentham in the England late 18th, early 19th century, and his followers, James Mill and John Stuart Mill, developed this. This is the view that there's in action, what we ought to do is to, but I want to deal not with the ought part, but just what we actually do. This is a sort of a doctrine called hedonism, is to maximize the balance of pleasure over pain. There are activities we can engage in that will derive pleasure from, like watching a pro wrestling match or anything else. You just think of what you want, anything that will give you pleasure. We want to avoid pain. And so what we're trying to do, according to this view at all times, is to get the best possible balance of pleasure over pain. Now, this is a kind of a feature of this view, is that when we're aiming at anything, we'll just consider the pleasure, we're not directly aiming at that thing itself. It's if I'm going to a pro wrestling match, the reason I'm doing that is not that I like pro wrestling, but it's I like the satisfactions or the feelings of pleasure that going there to that match are giving me. So what we would normally take to be particular things we're pursuing are, on this view, just means to getting certain states of satisfaction or certain pleasures. And so on this view, our ultimate ends are all subjective states of mind, and we're trying to achieve various of these good subjective states of mind and bad ones. Now, I think this view is open to very serious objections. I mean, first of all, it doesn't seem that it's always the case we're aiming for particular states of mind. Sometimes we just want to do certain things. Why should we say that? It's just particular satisfactions that we're trying to achieve, or dissatisfactions that we're trying to avoid. Why can't we say you're coming here just to hear this lecture? It's not that you're coming here because you're expecting to derive some sort of intellectual pleasure from listening to it. I can tell you, if you're thinking that's why you come to the wrong place. But why can't we say there are things we're aiming at directly, not just states of mind? And even if we are aiming at certain states of mind as we sometimes do, why should we say that we can add them all up in some kind of common currency of desire of satisfaction or dissatisfaction? So I think this view doesn't have much to recommend it, but even if you think it does, the crucial point for our purposes here is that, remember, in praxeology, we're considering what follows just from the concept of action, what follows just by thinking about action. And this theory, this hedonism, or this view of hedonism where a person is actually trying to achieve this balance of pleasure, best balance of pleasure over pain, it does not follow from the concept of action, even if you think that's it happens to be the right psychological theories. I don't think it is, but even if you thought that doesn't follow from the concept of action. So that when you read in Human Action and Man, Economy, and State, other books, that people are trying to maximize their utility, all that's meant is that they're picking the highest end on their value scale. It doesn't mean that they're trying to measure, you're trying to get a certain satisfaction, picking the highest satisfaction, taking satisfaction being some kind of subjective state of mind that they like. All that's meant is a purely formal notion of utility. All that's meant is that each person is picking the end that he or she values the most. So when then a fundamental principle in praxeology is that you can't measure interpersonal utility. You can't measure utility at all, let alone interpersonal utility. So you can't measure utility for each person, and you can't come up with a measure of utility between people. So one thing to avoid misunderstanding is you have to remember what I just said about the praxeology isn't committed to this view that people are trying to maximize certain subjective satisfaction. So this view doesn't mean, when you say you can't measure utility, it doesn't mean that utility is some kind of substance composed of satisfactions and it just turns out you can't measure it. What's meant is that by utility, you're just speaking of a preference ordering. Say I had different ends in mind, I'd rank one as the highest end, then the second highest, third highest. So there'd be there's no sense in saying what is the measure of utility, because it's just a ranking of different ends. Say I say, leaving this lecture room is now someone's highest goal. Then going on staying in the lecture room but going on his laptop and listening to some program is the second highest goal. So you see, you could rank the ends in order, but there wouldn't be any meaning to saying you're measuring utility. There's nothing to measure. Sometimes you'll see people saying the reason you can't measure utility is that it's an intensive magnitude. I don't think this is the right way of putting it, because if you say that suggests, or if not directly states, there's some sort of magnitude that you're measuring, but you're saying that for some reason you're unable to come up with what the correct figure is. You can't come up with an appropriate unit of measure. This isn't the right view from Austrian economics. It's just rather that you just have certain all you have is a ranking of preferences. There's no meaning given in Austrian economics to saying there's a measure of utility. You're just wanting particular things and you have them ranked in a certain way. Now, for example, you'll say, sometimes people will say, suppose somebody says, well, I think we should have a progressive income tax because, let's suppose, if you $1,000 to Bill Gates, say you take $1,000 from Bill Gates, it will matter much less to him than if you take $1,000 from a poor man who might need that money for his house and his food. So suppose you say, from the point of view of economics, we can't say that because it doesn't make sense to, there's no meaning to saying one person gets more utility than another from a certain amount of money. All we could say is Bill Gates has certain preferences and the poor man has other preferences. There's no meaning to saying that one gets more utility than another. But it doesn't follow from that we couldn't say in kind of a common sense way, suppose Bill Gates' accountant comes to him and said, we've made a mistake, your net worth is $1,000 less than we thought it was. It doesn't bother him at all. And then you go to a poor man and say you've lost $1,000 and the person is very upset about it. He's despondent. In a common sense way, it certainly makes sense to say it's bothered the poor man more than the losses bothered the poor man more than the losses bothered Bill Gates. But it's just we don't have such a concept in economics. But if you wanted to, from a point of view of libertarianism, that the fact that you could say it bothers somebody more than another isn't a good reason to take away money from one and give it to the other. But what I want to make clear is this isn't the fact that we can't use the statement in economics that somebody gets more utility from a certain amount of money than another. It just doesn't have any meaning. Doesn't mean we can't make ordinary common sense judgments about things that bother people or things that people like. The view that we can't measure utility is one that's not just found in Austrian economics, but quite generally accepted by most economists, although most economists, as I'll just be mentioning, have a different approach to utility from that of the Austrian school. There are a few economists and philosophers who do think you can measure interpersonal utility. For example, the Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen is one who says you can measure utility, and also I think he thinks you can, at least in some cases, measure interpersonal utility. And the philosopher Robert Nozick, I'm sure many of you have heard of him, also has a paper in his book, Socratic Puzzles, where he says he thinks you can measure utility. But I don't think they're not, when they say that, they're not really using the term utility as Austrians do. So in the way the Austrian economics uses utility, you can't measure utility because it would just have no meaning to speak of measuring a ranking of preference. I just mentioned, it was in Nozick's one rather odd feature in Nozick's article on utility. There's one passage in it where he said that I suggested something to him, and I have no memory of saying that to him, but I didn't care because at least he mentioned me in the article. I want to, before I turn from utility, we can get a little more utility about talking about utility, I want to mention how the mainstream neoclassical economics has a rather different approach to utility from the Austrians. Now remember, in the Austrian schools, I said a number of times, we're concerned just with what follows from the notion of action. So when we're talking about what choices confront an individual, the choices are whatever ones the actor has in mind. Sometimes, say you're thinking of doing something, you just have one option in mind, or you might have two or three or more, and you're thinking which one is the best one to do of those. But the mainstream neoclassical economics, you have a very different approach. What they do is they take all possible choices that are open to an actor at a time, and they consider that the individual ranks not only all those choices, but probability distributions about getting particular assortments of those. Say, I wouldn't just consider, say, getting an apple or an orange if those were two choices that I have, but I might consider probability distribution where I had half a chance of getting an apple or half a chance of getting an orange. So what they do is they'll have rankings. They'll think that the individual has rankings for all of those. Of course, they're aware that real people don't have such rankings, but they want to generate a model where you put this in, because then they can put in various all sorts of fancy mathematics, and they can do very elaborate things with it. I won't go into those mainly because I don't understand them very well. But one example, the great mathematician John von Neumann, I'll put him down. Now, von Neumann was one of the greatest 20th century mathematicians. He had a colleague, Oscar Morgenstern, who had actually been in Mises' seminar. And they developed a way, if you take all these probability distributions, they showed that just by having a list of preferences, you can come up with a scale that wasn't completely cardinal numbers, but it was close to it. So you could come up with some sort of measurements. It wouldn't be cardinal. You wouldn't be really measuring utility in a strict sense, but it would be much closer to measuring utility than we would use in Austrian economics if you incorporate all these assumptions, like that people have particular probability distributions over any possible choice they confront. But we don't do that in Austrian economics. We're just concerned with what follows from the notion of action. Now, another principle I'll mention that's used in mainstream economics, that in talking about utility theory, that is not used in Austrian economics, is the principle of transitivity of preference. I'll put this down, transitivity. Okay, now what this idea is, suppose I prefer a ticket to a pro wrestling match to an orange, and I prefer an orange to an apple, but I prefer an apple to a ticket to a pro wrestling match. This set of choices would violate transitivity. You see, you can't have this set of choices. You prefer A to B, B to C, and C to A, according to people who support that this is somehow supposed to be irrational. But to do it that way. Now, sometimes you'll see this, people say, they'll state transitivity in this way. They'll say, if you prefer A to B and B to C, then you shouldn't prefer C to A. If I prefer a pro wrestling ticket to an orange and an orange to an apple, then I shouldn't prefer an apple to a pro wrestling ticket. But as Bob Nozick liked to point out, this isn't a correct way of stating the principle, because maybe I should prefer an apple to a pro wrestling ticket. What the correct way of saying is that I shouldn't have, to preserve transitivity, I shouldn't have that set of preferences, A to B, B to C, and C to A. It doesn't tell you, the principle doesn't tell you that what to do if you do have this set of preferences. It's just saying you shouldn't have that set. But this isn't a requirement in Austrian economics. You'll find, if you're interested in this, there's a discussion in Human Action that Mises has. I think it's in the Scholars List, page 103, where he points out this is not something we could derive just from the notion of action. It's not given, these choices aren't given to us at a single time. We can't require transitivity. Another one that's sometimes given is, again, we don't use this in Austrian economics, principle called the independence of irrelevant alternatives. Okay, I'll give you an example of this. Let's suppose someone's having dinner in a restaurant, and the waiter says to the person, you have a choice of apple pie or cherry pie for dessert. And the person says, I'll take apple pie. And then a few minutes later, the waiter comes out and said, we also have peach pie today. Now, if the person says, oh, well, in that case, I'll take the cherry pie, he's violated its independence of irrelevant alternatives. If you've chosen one over the other, then bring in another alternative shouldn't change your preference ranking over the first two. Again, this isn't one that's used in Austrian economics because it's not required by the concept of action that people adhere to this. We might think that was a kind of an odd preference, but there wouldn't be anything that Austrians would rule out just by definition. Now, I want to address another issue that I haven't talked about so far in the previous lecture. This is another principle that you get when you're considering the concept of action. That Mises says that human action involves the uncertainty of the future. That we want to ask, in what sense is this true? Now, in my own view, which is perhaps a bit on the heretical side, people tend to take an overly broad view of what this future uncertainty is. The sense in which I think the principle is true is this. Suppose I was thinking of some action like, say I'm thinking of running out the room screaming right now. That's what I'd like to do. But I think, yes, I mean, that wasn't a joke either. So, suppose that I believe that it's impossible for me to do so. If I were to try that, there would be some kind of invisible force that would prevent me from doing that. I'm convinced of that. Then I'm not going to do it. In order to act, I have to think that it's at least possible that I'll be able to achieve the end I want, or by the means I propose to use, or at least I have to think it would somehow raise the probability of my achieving the end by using that means. If I thought it was hopeless, there would be no point in acting. I mean, suppose as I thought yesterday, I thought it's or the day before, it's much too hot, and I wish the sun would go down. I can't do anything to make the sun go down or to get the temperature cooler, so I'm not going to act to try to achieve that. It wouldn't make any sense to act if I thought that I couldn't achieve that. But sometimes people take this notion of future uncertainty in what I consider a much too broad way. They'll think, because something involves the future, I really can't know anything about it. But, I think I can say in a perfectly ordinary sense that I know that, say, in another half hour, I'm not going to be speaking here. I'll be outside the room. Why can't, there seems to be no reason in principle to say that just because there's something you're talking about the future that you can't know it. Some economists like Ludwig Lachmann, who was a well-known Austrian economist, wrote on very important books on capital theory. I'll put him down. He stressed future uncertainty, the uncertainty of the future very much. He thought we really couldn't know anything at all about the future, and this was really a great limitation on economic theory. And a colleague of his, G.L.S. Shackle, had a book called Epistemics in Economics, setting forth that view at great length. I remember Lachmann once told me, he was a very, very interesting man. He had a very strong German accent, which I'm not going to imitate, but he told me that he recommended Shackle's book, Epistemics in Economics, very strongly. So I got a copy of it, and I looked at the dedication. It was dedicated to Lachmann. You can see why at least one reason he recommended it. But I would just say on that topic, some people think they apparently think there's some sort of profound philosophical argument that we can't know anything about the future, but if there is, I certainly don't know what it is. I'd like to know, but I've never come across one. So I think we just have to take this notion when we talk about uncertainty about the future. It just means if you know that you can't achieve your end, you're not going to act. So the future is uncertain in the sense that you think it's open to you to act, to achieve whatever it is you want. Now, in the time left, before I have questions, I think I'll just talk about a bit more on two things. One is a slight difference in emphasis between Mises and Murray Rothbard. Mises will talk about the theorems of economics as being true a priori. I'll put this. Whereas Rothbard tends to talk more about them being necessary, the proposition of economics are necessary. So one asks, what is the difference between talking about a priori and necessary? Well, when we say something is a priori, that means, it's what I try to express in sort of non-technical ways, saying we can know it just by thinking about it. So it isn't that we have to go out and test the statement or do experiments to find out. We just think about it and we can realize that it's true. Now, it's crucial here to note 2 points. When we say we can know about it by thinking about it, it doesn't mean that we have to know about it that way. I mean, supposing, say, you believed some proposition in economics because you read it in Human Action and you believed Mises was a great economist and he was very likely right. then you wouldn't be knowing, you might know the statement to be true, but you wouldn't be knowing it just by thinking about it. You would be knowing it because you read it in a particular book. So when you say something's a priori true, you mean you can know it just by thinking about it. And again, the point I mentioned in my lecture on Monday, it doesn't, the claim that something is a priori doesn't mean that, doesn't say how you got the concepts, how you learned about the proposition in the first place. It's just how, once you have the proposition, you know that the proposition is true. Now, one way we can might ask, well, how could we know things just by thinking about them? Well, one way we can know them is we see that certain relationships are conceptually required. We see they couldn't be otherwise. Suppose I say what would be an example? Suppose I say that a colored object, an object with a certain color, has a certain extension. It's spread out in space. That any object that has a color also has an extension. I could say, well, just thinking about that, I see it has to be true. So what I'm seeing there is that the statement is necessary. That's to say, there isn't an imaginable circumstance where that statement is false. So when you're talking about something being necessary, that has to do with what is the case in the world. It's what they call a statement about ontology, what sorts of things there are. So if you say something is necessary, you're saying what's there in the world. Whereas when you talk about a priori, this is having to do with our knowledge of the world. It's a statement of what we know. So one way we can know a priori is to see, we get a direct perception or understanding of necessity. So you see the connection there. One way of knowing a priori truth is to see what's necessary. Now, not all a priori truths are necessary, at least some people think would restrict a priori truths to necessary ones, but I mean, there are plausible ones that aren't. Suppose I say now, I exist, that's one that I can know just by thinking about it, but it's not a necessary truth. We can easily imagine circumstances where I don't exist, so it's not necessary, but I can still know it a priori. So, Mises, who was somewhat of a follower of Kant in epistemology, tended to stress more the a priori character. He would talk very much about what we can know just by thinking about it, because he thought there are certain categories or concepts that we have to use in thinking about the world. Whereas Rothbard tended more to talk about, he was an Aristotelian and Thomist in his philosophy, he tended to talk about necessary truths that we thought we see directly, we understand directly certain necessary properties about action, but there isn't a very sharp divergence between them. It's just there is this difference of emphasis. So I thought I'd mention that because sometimes people wonder about that. Now, I think the last topic I'll mention before I turn over to questions is one that I started to talk about at the end of my last lecture, but I didn't have time to go into all the details that I wanted to say about it. This has to do with the very influential criticisms that Karl Popper and his followers have raised against praxeology. Now, Popper himself was not a classical liberal, but he had a very high opinion of Mises. If you look at, there's a volume of his correspondence that just came out a year or so ago, and he mentions his extremely high regard for Mises. He met Mises in Vienna, and he was very impressed by him. You get the feeling from his letter he thought he was clearly in the presence of a great man, but he said that Mises really was rather dismissive of him. He thought he was completely off base in his views. As usual, Mises was right. Now, what Popper's basic idea was, this is mentioned before, that he had a revolutionary approach to the problem of induction. I remember the problem of induction is thing, I suppose I say, when I leave the room, say I decide I really would go out screaming, say I ran out the room, why would I open the door before I ran out? Why wouldn't I just go through the door? Well, the obvious answer is, I would know from past experiences you can't exit a room unless you open the door. If you just try to go through, you'll just hurt yourself. So here I'm relying on a principle that the future is going to resemble the past. And Popper said, no, that's completely unjustified. We don't have any grounds at all for saying that if I ran directly at the door, I'd get my face smashed in. So it's not a good idea. We don't have any grounds at all for saying that. What we can do is just have a hypothesis that I should open the door to go out rather than try to run into the door if I want to avoid getting my face smashed up. And then I can see if I'm right, then I'll go through the door. If I'm wrong, then my hypothesis will be falsified. So he thought, Popper's view, there's no such thing as verification of hypothesis. No matter how many times I went through the open door, that wouldn't make it more likely that if I went through the door the next time, that would be the best way to do it rather than just leaving the door closed and trying to get out by running into the closed door. I wouldn't have any base at all for that. I would just say, so far my hypothesis hasn't been falsified. So this is the way he solves, very much in quotation marks, the problem of induction. So what he says then is, he thinks that the criterion for a scientific statement is that the statement be falsifiable. I could describe some possible circumstance in which the hypothesis is false. And this, as I mentioned the last time, raises a severe problem for praxeology, because the praxeological principles are ones that are necessarily true. There aren't imaginable circumstances, say, in which there is an action that doesn't involve the use of means to achieve ends, or ones where people make an exchange, but there isn't this double inequality that I mentioned. So the propositions of Austrian economics are not falsifiable, therefore they're not scientific, according to Popper's view. Now, the Mises had what I thought is an excellent reply to this, which you'll find in his 1962 book, Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science. He says, well, why should we care if economics fulfills Popper's definition of science? Why shouldn't we, on the contrary, say economics is a science and we're trying to come up with a criterion for scientific statements? We have to take economics as one of the examples and go on that basis rather than rule this out by Popper's criterion. And I think we can see that, as I explained how Popper derives the criterion, it isn't a plausible view at all. It just rules out all our ordinary knowledge of the world. I can't say that if I jumped out the window, I'd fall to the ground and hurt myself. I could say I could have a hypothesis that if I did that, I'd fall, but I have no reason to think that's more true than anything to the contrary. Of course, one could ask why Popper himself didn't run out into the street, but I guess he was more sensible than his theory indicated. But now, suppose somebody said, well, we can accept this falsification criterion without the baggage of Popper's implausible solution to the problem of induction. There, though, I think we could still say it rules out a great deal of our ordinary knowledge. I mentioned this a bit before, but I'll go over it. Suppose we take a statement such as there's intelligent life on some planet in the universe other than on Earth. We could keep examining various planets, and we didn't find intelligent life on this one, We could keep going, but if there's an infinite number of planets, then we could never falsify, in principle, this statement. There's intelligent life on some planet other than Earth, but it seems like it's a perfectly ordinary, possible scientific statement, but it wouldn't be a scientific statement according to Popper because it couldn't be falsified. So I think even then, if we consider this criterion apart from Popper's odd views on induction, there's no reason to accept it. So I think I talked about quite a few different topics, but now I'll leave the rest of the time open if anybody has questions. Yeah.
I'm going to take a wild speculative stab at something. I'm probably just confused, but I was interested in your example of something you know a priori which isn't necessarily true.
Yeah.
You gave the example, I exist.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's a contingent factor.
Look, yes, that was a wild speculative stab too.
Taking it as a contingent factor
Yes.
that you're just writing. It just struck me, is it possible to reframe all a priori statements, such as the axiom and I exist, as hypothetical, so that you have the following: if I exist, if I think that I exist, I necessarily exist. Not if I exist necessarily. So that if humans act, then time, scarcity, etc. follows. So it's true as a hypothetical proposition, but not as an asserted proposition.
Yes, there's a sign here saying, please repeat audience question before answering. So the question was a suggestion, could we reformulate all a priori propositions as hypotheticals so that, say, instead of saying human beings act, we say if human beings exist, then they act.
I'm sorry, could we reframe all hypothetical propositions in order to derive necessity?
Yes.
In a priori.
Oh, I see. The question is, could we reframe them in order to derive them as necessary, just make them hypotheticals? Well, I mean, you could certainly, from a categorical statement, make it a hypothetical one, but it isn't clear why we couldn't say that we have categorical knowledge of certain necessary propositions, why we should reframe it in that way. So I'd say you might be able to do that, but I'm not clear what the motivation would be for doing that. That would be perhaps the idea would be we don't have categorical knowledge of anything necessary, but I'm not seeing any reason to think that.
The motivation would be to defend a variety of skepticism, which would say, for all I know, solipsism is true.
Mm-hmm.
I possibly act, but I don't know what you do, etc., etc. It's all you can prove from the action accident is if there is someone who's acting in all these characters, all these characteristics, and all these categories follow. But
yeah. Oh, I see. Well, you're suggesting that it doesn't follow from the action axiom that there are other people than myself. Well, I think that's perfectly right. I mean, I don't think, as I think I mentioned in the earlier lecture, praxeology isn't attempting to solve the problem of skepticism or problem of other minds. I don't think solipsism is a very plausible position. I think there was a British logician, Mrs. Ladd Franklin, who once wrote to Bertrand Russell that she found solipsism such a plausible view that she wondered why more people don't adopt it. But I think you're quite right. I mean, we're not in praxeology trying to solve the problem of other minds or skepticism. Yeah.
Human action is basically defined as purposeful behavior, and all the reactions that people think are basically full away. That's a reaction. That's not part of human action. So lately, modern research in neuroscience has removed the line between reactions and thoughtful behavior. The line is getting less and less clear. So I was wondering what are your thoughts on that?
The question was that in human actions is defined as purposeful behavior, but so actions such as reflex, pulling away if somebody hits you wouldn't count as action. And the suggestion was neurosciences tended to change the boundaries between actions and reflexes. So what would be significance is, well, I think it could very well turn out that certain things we thought of actions turn out to be reflex, but I don't think it's at all plausible to think that neuroscience is going to eliminate the notion of action. So it's not a theory that we act, it's something that's directly given to us. It's not a theory that we have beliefs that somehow some future science is going to, so we'll find out, oh, we were wrong all this time, just as people at one time thought that witches exist. Now we find out that beliefs don't exist. There are some philosophers like Paul and Patricia Churchland who give that view. It's called eliminativism. But I must say it seems like a completely implausible view. I don't think I'm not familiar with any stuff in neurosciences, may show my own ignorance of the field, who established it. There was a book by PMS Hacker, has a very long book on neuroscience you might look into, where he rather criticizes claims of a kind you mentioned, but I suppose one could just ask those neuroscientists whether they believed their own theories. So if they said yes, they'd be in a bit of trouble. I think we have to, yeah.
I was wondering, suppose you had one person have an a priori reaction and say that we're sitting in an election. And then you had another person that had an a priori reaction and said we're not sitting in an election. So you had two reactions that were in direct conflict with one another. How would you resolve that from the practical perspective?
Well, you see, remember, as characterized a priori knowledge, it's a type of knowledge, so at least one of them would have be incorrect. I mean, how you would show which one it was would just depend on the particular circumstances. But, I mean, this wouldn't have, since one of the requirements of knowledge is that if you know some proposition, the proposition has to be true, it couldn't be the case that people both know a proposition and its denial. That wouldn't have anything to do with whether it's a priori or not. It's just ruled out. So somebody may have made a mistake. You just have to figure out in the concrete case who it was. I think we have time for one more. Lady.
According to Ludwig human action, human beings have the ability of free choice to choose
Yeah.
between their preferences, but they are also constrained by their choices. So my question is, under praxeology, is everything certain?
The statement was, according to Mises, we have free choice, but we're also constrained by our choices. So according to praxeology, is everything certain? Well, I mean, I'm not sure what you have in mind by everything. I mean, what?
Is human action certain? Is the marginal utility theory?
Well, if we start with true statements and we've correctly reasoned about it, then I think we can say that what we've come up with is true. I mean, we're not infallible. We can make mistakes, but I mean, I think we can be reasonably certain about some things. I mean, that would just, I suppose, depend on the particular deduction. But I mean, I think the principles of praxeology seem on pretty solid ground to me. So I guess that'll be it. Thanks very much.